a guided tour of 50 great works of literature with Joseph Pearce. Today on The Simple Truth, I'm Jim Havens. We consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of Saint Joseph. Our guest today, Joseph Pearce, author of numerous literary studies, including Literary Converts, The Quest for Shakespeare, and Catholic Literary Giants, as well as biographies of Oscar Wilde, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, and Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. He's also the general editor of the Ignatius Critical Editions series, and he's the author of the book we're here to discuss today, Classic Literature Made Simple. You can get it from Ignatius Press, ignatius.com, ignatius.com. Joseph Pearce, welcome back to The Simple Truth. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Great blessing to have you with us. So in the introduction here on the reading of good and bad books, you categorize 4 types of books and explain the one type of book that you're recommending for us in the book Classic Literature Made Simple. Can you explain these distinctions for us?
Yes, so it's applying logic, if you like, to literature. So books can be great, shall we say, or good in terms of their literary merit, in other words, in terms of their, shall we say, artistic beauty, and also in terms of their moral conformity to that which is good, true, and beautiful, and ultimately, of course, to the teachings of the Church as taught by Christ. So a book can be good in both of these ways or not. So then you apply that logically. A book can be good, in the sense of good morals and good literature, or it can be good morals but bad literature, or it can be bad morals but good literature, or bad, both bad in terms of morality and bad in terms of literature. So what I suggest is that we should, once we learn to discern the difference, that we should ensure that as far as possible we concentrate only on reading good books, especially as our Western civilization, our Christian civilization has given us hundreds of these to read, so more than enough to keep all of us happy. So we shouldn't really be wasting our time with bad good bad, or bad books.
I love the way you lay that out. And yeah, it's great. I think that logic carries over as well, really for any type of storytelling. We watch a lot of movies or shows, things like that. Same thing, right? What are the good movies or shows that are out there? That list may be a lot smaller than the good literature we have down through the centuries here. And you give us a great tour of it all in this great book, Classic Literature Made Simple. You give us nutshells, snapshot summaries of each of these 50 titles. And in chronological order is the way you take them, from the ancient Iliad to the recent Father Elijah. And if my count is correct, there are also 8 authors here who have multiple works on the list, 2 apiece from Homer, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton, J.R.R. Tolkien, 3 from Sophocles, and then 11 from William Shakespeare, the undisputed victor. Does this make Shakespeare the greatest storyteller of all time in your view? And what else would you like to say about the prominence of Shakespeare on the list?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I usually think of there being 3 giants that straddle the history of civilization, like colossuses, if you like. So the first is Homer, the giant of antiquity, of the pre-Christian world of ancient Greece. Then we have Dante, the greatest of all Catholic poets from the High Middle Ages. And then you have William Shakespeare from what the historians call the early modern period, from the late 1500s, early 1600s. And these 3 are side by side, shoulder to shoulder. I don't necessarily want to suggest that that Dante's greater than Homer, or that Shakespeare's greater than Homer or Dante. But the point is that Shakespeare's written over 30 plays, all of which are brilliant. And Dante's written relatively little, Vita Nuova and the Divine Comedy. So you're never going to have as many works by Dante. Same with Homer. He only wrote 2, and they're both in there. So in that sense, he's got 100% representation. Shakespeare only has 30% representation. So it depends which way you want to look at it.
Yes, very good. And I also noticed, so up through Shakespeare, you've got this literature that is really it's poetry, it's theater, it's plays, and then right after Shakespeare, you get Don Quixote, Cervantes, and this is I guess the first official novel that would be recognized. This is number 22 in chronological order here. Anything to share on that distinction about when the novel comes into history?
Yeah, I mean, scholars will debate and dispute this. Some people might say that Mallory's Morte d'Arthur, which is slightly earlier, as a novel, but I don't really think it is. I think that probably it is fair, at least works the greatness that have stood the test of time, to say that Don Quixote by Cervantes is the first great novel, and then begins the era of the novel. Prior to that, there weren't any novels, so the best-selling writers, the best-selling authors that were famous and known to everybody prior to the advent of the novel were poets and playwrights. Of course, Shakespeare's both. He wrote both sonnets, longer poems, and plays. But it was always poetry and drama were the two ways by which literature was expressed prior to the advent of the novel.
Anything in terms of any difference that you notice of the themes that we get up until the time of the novel? There are various themes that do seem to carry over into a lot of these great works. Are those same themes represented as we get into the era of the novel and going forward? Or does something sort of change thematically? Anything that you notice there?
The most important thing, and this is what ultimately makes the great books great, is that they continue to speak to us across the centuries. In other words, they're saying things to us which are perennially true, that don't become out of date, don't become dated. As C.S. Lewis said, the fashions are always coming and going, but mostly going. So if something's up to date, it's going to be out of date soon. What we're really interested in things are those things that are perennial, the permanent things. And that's what really means that's to understand who we are and our relationship with ourselves, with each other, and with God and with the cosmos. These are the key questions that the great works of literature ask. And as regards ourselves, there are three classical understandings of who we are as human beings. We're not the modern understandings, Homo sapiens, wise man. Anybody who knows anything about the history of humanity knows that wisdom is not what characterizes us. What we more likely could be considered to be stupid, quite frankly. Each generation makes the same mistakes as every previous generation because we're not willing to learn the lessons of the past. That's not wisdom. So we're not Homo sapiens. We're not Homo economicus, another modern label for us. We're just merely cogs in the economic machine here to be producers and consumers and nothing else. What we are in a classical sense is anthropos, the Greek word for man, he who turns up in wonder to the heavens and asks deep questions. Then Homo Viator, man on a journey, man on the pilgrimage of life, that each of our lives is a journey and a quest, ultimately in a Christian understanding of things, the quest for heaven. And then Homo Superbus, the person who refuses to the journey, who refuses the quest, who goes his own way or refuses to go anywhere. Instead, Homo Superbus, proud man. And the key thing is that each of us is both of those people, Homo Viator and Homo Superbus. So as Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn and other great writers have told us, the battle between good and evil takes place in each individual human heart, because we are both Homo Viator, man on the pilgrimage, man on the quest for heaven, but we're also Homo Superbus, proud man, the sinner, who would rather do his own thing rather than do what he should do. So that war that takes place in every human heart, therefore takes place in every human society, and therefore takes place in every great work of literature, which holds up a mirror to the world in which we live and to ourselves.
That's really one of the reasons that all of these works are considered great or good in that second sense of getting at the truth of these questions. They're all dealing with these same universal questions and getting at the truth of it from Homer to Father Elijah.
Absolutely. So what we see, if you go back to almost 3,000 years now, to say, no one knows for certain when Homer wrote, but let's say 700 or 800 years before the time of Christ, to the 21st century where we are now, because the two most recent books in classic literature made simple are by contemporary authors who are still alive. So basically, for almost 3,000 years, these great works of literature have continued basically to show us the greatest and deepest truths about ourselves, about our relationship with God, and about our relationship with each other.
Excellent. I'm talking with Joseph Pearce here today. We're talking about his book, Classic Literature Made Simple. You can get it at Ignatius.com, Ignatius.com. Right at the end here, you give us a final wish. You say, we will end with a final wish that these brief commentaries will serve as appetizers, offering a foretaste of what readers might expect when they delve and dive deeper into classic literature, whetting the appetite for more. If this slim volume inspires the reading of the classic works themselves, the wish will be granted, and the author's laborers will be richly rewarded. Anything further there about this text that you give us, this great new book, Classic Literature Made Simple, as a jumping off point into these great works?
Yeah, so as I've said there, is that on the one hand, this is a good way for people that know they haven't read enough literature, and there's 50 of them here. They can read it, in a few hours and get an overview of 50 of the greatest works of Christian and Western civilization. But my hope is that they'll become particularly interested and intrigued by some of them when they read about some of these works, that there will be appetizers that will entice them to actually go and order the main course, so to speak, to actually go and buy the book itself and read the book itself. Because I'm hoping that this will not just be an introduction that allows us to see the whole picture panoramically, but will allow us and invite us to go deeper into some of these texts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I find it very, very helpful. So grateful that you have written this. Joseph Pearce, Classic Literature Made Simple. Again, Ignatius.com. Ignatius.com. We're going to be getting into some of these works as we get back. And when you look at the list of 50, I don't know about you, you'll have to take a look at that list for yourself and sort of see, okay, how many of these have I actually read? How many of these have I actually heard of? Might be even a question for some of us. I think I've heard of almost all of them on the list. There were a few I had never heard of before, but really have not read anywhere near enough of them. This is very helpful to give an introduction. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.
Did you know you can help evangelize simply by using your cell phone? The Station of the Cross is partnering with iCatholic Mobile, America's only Catholic mobile phone company. When you join iCatholic Mobile, a portion of every dollar will support our programming. Plus, you'll enjoy great service with iCatholic Unlimited 5G data, text, and talk. With iCatholic Mobile, you can stay connected with family and friends while also spreading the truth of Jesus Christ with clarity and charity. Join today at iCatholicMobile.com.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Joseph Pearce. We're talking about his book, Classic Literature Made Simple. You can get it from the publisher, Ignatius Press, Ignatius.com. Also recommend you go over to Joseph Pearce's website itself. A lot of great information there. Learn more about him and his good work. All the books there as well. jpearce.co. That's jpearce.co. All right, I do want to get into some of these works themselves and see which ones you want to lift out for us today. But maybe we can get into it this way. If there are folks listening, and I imagine that there are, who maybe don't have much of an introduction into classic literature, but they do have a desire, maybe just haven't had much of an introduction. They've been focused in other fields, whatever. They can come to this book. They can get a good sense of an overview and of the various works on this list. But is there a particular place that you would say, hey, if you want to start diving into these great books, to these good books, maybe start with this one or these few, any place that you would recommend to begin?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. But I think I probably have to say that the reason, or at least one of the reasons I wrote this book, was for this book to be that. In other words, if someone is aware that they really would like to know more about the great works of literature, and they feel sort of as if this is something which is missing from their storeroom of knowledge, shall we say, then this is a good book to start, because then they can read about these 50 books, and some of them would interest them more than others. So, and of course, the difficulty is that every reader, as in with every person, is unique and different. So in order to answer the question as regards to which specific books from those 50 would I recommend, I'd really need to know more about the person asking the question. Are they interested in theology, philosophy, history, poetry or prose, drama, or novels? All those sort of questions would be questions I'd need to ask to answer that specific question to each specific individual. My book will serve as an introduction for all people, and then they can read those 50 books and then 50 chapters, short essay, 1,000 or so words on each book. and come to their own mind as to which works are going to be most interesting for them as individuals.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also, some of these works, depending on what sort of educational opportunities your children, if you're a parent, may be involved in. Look, if they're blessed enough, if you have children that you have been able to get them in a place where they are sort of soaking in an educational environment of formation, where they're getting, these great books, classical literature works like these on this list, before them through their education that's already provided for them, that's wonderful. At the same time, it might seem like, they're being forced to do something if it's coming through a school or some sort of activity like that. Sadly, that's oftentimes how children receive it. But with this book, I think it does. I mean, the title says it all. Classic literature made simple. A very appropriate title because that's exactly what it does. It makes it simple. It makes it interesting. Each one of these works of 50, it's not giving you too much or too little, just a few pages, just to give you a sense of what's going on there. And from a well-formed Catholic man, I couldn't think of anybody better as far as a well-formed Catholic person who is deep in this stuff, in literature, the world of literature, that is our guide through these 50 works than Joseph Pearce. So I highly recommend this. This is very simple. You get a very quick introduction, a little thought at the end, and you're just diving into these works one by one. And it's a quick, interesting, wonderful read. So I would recommend this also for young people as we approach the time of giving gifts around Christmas here. Great gift for young people, but I would also say older folks as well, for exactly that need that we were talking about, that need to kind of put those that intellectual framework together. It's good to know what what the history is down through the ages, and you can sort of trace the history of thinking, the history of thought, the history of art through literature that we get in this simple digest here. Classic literature made simple. Again, Ignatius.com is where you can go. Joseph, one title jumped out to me as I was reading through the book, and that is this title, The Betrothed. And the reason why is I did hear of this once, and it struck me when I had heard it one time, but I've never gotten around to actually picking it up and reading it. But your first couple sentences here really do whet the appetite in the sense of the greatness of this work, where you say, if the greatest masterpiece of Italian literature, Dante's Divine Comedy, could realistically be acclaimed as the greatest poem ever written, the other great masterpiece of Italian literature, The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, could be acclaimed as the greatest ever novel. So that's pretty high praise. What can you tell us about this work, The Betrothed?
Yeah, and I don't think it's hyperbole. I mean, I'm struggling to think. I think of other novels that you could argue are as good as, but I can't think of any that I would argue as being better than. So I do think it's not hyperbolic. I think that this is a novel which we all should know, and very few of us do. So it was written in the early 1800s, around the same sort of time as Jane Austen and those writers were writing in England. Alessandro Manzoni was a revert to the faith. He had drifted away as a young man, become very revolutionary, very anti-Catholic, but had returned to the faith and was a very good, pious, solid Catholic when he wrote this novel. And it's basically, as the title would suggest, The Betrothed. It's about a young man and a young woman who are betrothed to be married. And then because of corruption and tyranny locally, and also a cowardice on the part of their local priest, they are forced to be separated. And then the novel really is the various adventures that both of them have in the hope and the quest to be reunited with each other. And it's set against a real historical backdrop. So it's set about 150 or so years earlier than that, with some very holy priest characters, including a real life historical figure as a Cardinal Borromeo, not St. Charles Borromeo, but I think his nephew, who was also a Cardinal of Milan and also very holy, but not thus far canonized person. But he's a major character in the novel. So it's an historical novel, which is very Catholic, but also a great love story.
Yes, wonderful. What other titles of the 50 really jump out to you to share with us today?
Well, I mean, again, we mentioned Dante as the greatest poem arguably ever written. Dante's Divine Comedy is a work of literature which we all should at least know something about. It's not necessarily a very easy work to read. You really have to have notes to go with it. So reading the right translation and the right edition is important. I give advice about that. But the key thing is that Dante was a disciple of St. Thomas Aquinas. So he's a Thomist, he's Thomistic in his understanding of theology and philosophy. And it's this great adventure. Dante, in some sense, the character in the story. So Dante's the author of the story, but he's also a character in the story. And really, in some sense, he's an everyman figure. So we can see ourselves in him. And he begins basically in a midlife crisis. And then on Maundy Thursday, so on Holy Thursday, trapped in the dark wood of sin, unable to escape. And through the intercession of the saints, beginning with the Blessed Virgin, he receives guidance and is guided into hell on Good Friday so that he can look the reality of sin in the face and realize the horrific consequences of sin. And then he emerges on Easter Sunday morning into the light of the sun at the foot of Mount Purgatory. And then he ascends Mount Purgatory, having his sins forgiven in the sense of a penitential spirit, and eventually having ascended Mount Purgatory, he's lifted into heaven, into the company of the saints, and the poem ends with this beautiful Dante being given a brief vision of the beatific vision of the triune God with Christ within it. So it's a mystical, marvelous work, which is very deep in theology and philosophy, profoundly Catholic, profoundly Thomistic, and is a work all of us should at least know better than we probably do.
How does Paradise Lost by John Milton, how does that relate in terms of, it seems to be of the same genre. Any thoughts you can share with us on Milton's work?
Yeah, well, there's a paradox here, the paradox of Paradise Lost, if you like, because, I talk about reading good books, and I'm not sure, this might be the only book in the 50 that I'm not completely convinced is a good book. The reason I say that is it's certainly good as art. It's a great work of epic poetry. What Milton's trying to do is to emulate Homer and Virgil in writing this long, epic narrative in verse form. But what he does, he sort of anthropomorphizes Satan. He turns Satan into a human person, if you like, with sort of human characteristics, and he becomes a sort of anti-hero, and he displays courage, and he goes on a guerrilla raid against the Almighty God. And there are many people, such as the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley and many moderns, who sympathize with Milton's Satan, and that's because the Satan that Milton presents, is sort of quasi-human. A quasi-human rebel, not this monstrous demon, which you see, for instance, in Dante's Divine Comedy at the bottom of hell, where he's just seen insatiably hungry for souls and eating eternally the souls of the proud and the treacherous, but trapped in a sea of ice. No, Milton's Satan goes on a daring guerrilla raid into the Garden of Eden. He manages to outwit the angels, and so there are those that if you like have rebellious spirits against Christianity, have taken up Milton's Satan as a hero, as the sort of anti-hero of post-modernity, if you like. So I think he's a problematic character, and it's connected to the fact that Milton was himself a problematic character. Not only was he not Catholic, he wasn't even truly Protestant in the sense that he wasn't a Trinitarian. He believed that the Son was a creature created by the Father. That's evident from the poem. In that sense, of course, he's not even technically speaking a Christian, because surely the bare minimum, what C.S. Lewis would call the highest common factor, the bare minimum that makes a Christian is a belief in the Trinity, and that Father, Son, and Holy Ghost as being one, and a belief in the incarnation, that God becomes man. Well, if the Son is a creature, then God doesn't become man, right? A creature becomes man.
Yeah, very interesting. Joseph Pearce is with us. We're talking about his work, Classic Literature Made Simple. You can get it at Ignatius.com, Ignatius.com. I've tried to look into a little bit just out of my own interest to say, what were the first stories ever told? What do we have in terms of the oldest literature? I seem to have come across, as far as what I could see in a pretty quick look a while back, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a couple thousand years BC. Then you've got the Iliad and Odyssey of Homer. That's how we begin the list here in Classic Literature Made Simple, written about 8th century BC. And so we've got that work. I'm going to ask Joseph as we get back. I hear the music heading into the hard break here. When we get back, I'm going to ask him about that. Why do we begin there with Homer? What did the Greeks know? What did they figure out at this time that really makes it the beginning of this list? Any comment in terms of what came before that? And why maybe that would not be classified as one of these good books. So we'll ask about that. We'll also, as we go, get into the more recent literature on the list. There's a lot here that's on the list that is over the last few hundred years. And he mentioned also as well, there's a couple titles where the authors are still living. We'll talk about those as well. So we've got a lot to get to still here. Only about halftime on the show today. We're going to be right back with Joseph Pearce. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Joseph Pearce talking about his book, Classic Literature Made Simple. Ignatius.com is where you can find it, Ignatius.com. Also, find more about Joseph Pearce and his good work over at his website, jpearce.co. That's jpearce.co. All right. So, yeah, just a question here, Joseph, about the beginning of the list with Homer, with the Greeks. We've got Homer and Sophocles here, the Iliad and the Odyssey from Homer, obviously great works. And I think pretty much any high school student, even if they're going to a government public school, is probably still going to come across the Iliad and the Odyssey, I hope. And so, again, that might be pushed on them in a way at times in a more you have to read this type of a manner, but there is a great gift here. There's something that the Greeks did really give us here in Homer that is a wonderful blessing to us if we have the eyes to see. Anything you want to share about starting there and maybe anything that came before? What's the difference between what Homer gives us?
Yeah, well, I would recommend that people read G.K. Chesterton's History of the World, if you like, the Everlasting Man. Because the first chapter, that's the man in the cave. And the key thing is that we've been telling stories to each other since we were around at the beginning. I'm sure that Adam and Eve told stories to each other, right? So in other words, the storytelling is part of who we are as human persons, right? Communicating truth through narrative, right? We see it in the parable of the prodigal son, in the gospel, right? That basically we understand reality by telling stories, and one of the ways we understand reality. So it goes right back to the beginning. The key issue is, of course, as Chesterton says there, we don't know that primitive men lived in caves. They may have lived in wooden houses, but the wooden houses would not have survived. Only the cave survives. So that's the whole point here, is that the literature may well, I mean, we mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest that we know of, but there may well be older works of literature that just haven't survived. And then, of course, prior to that, people were telling stories verbally before they started to write them down. And literature just means something was written down. So, that we have cultures until fairly recently in Africa, for instance, that had a great narrative tradition. They had great stories that they told. But a lot of these have been lost because they weren't written down, right? And then you have, a few generations, change of culture, newcomers moving in, such as, Europeans, and that culture's lost. And then so is that heritage because it was not written down. So the key thing about Greek civilization is it was civilized in the best sense of the word, that they were literate. Right? They could write and they could read, which means that when people were telling stories, they could also then record those stories by writing them down so that others could read them. And that's the key thing about it. So that the ancient Greek culture, 700 or 800 years before the time of Christ, the age of Homer, that these great epics which were probably were told verbally. And then Homer takes these stories that have been told for generations and writes them down into one a narrative structure, putting his own gifted storytelling into the narrative, and therefore, if you like, immortalizing it so that we, almost 3,000 years later, can be reading it and discussing it as we're doing now.
Yeah, wonderful. And, I do want to mention as well Virgil's Aeneid, which is another one that is, I would think, still every high school student would maybe come across. Maybe I'm just being hopeful there. But you say, look, the Aeneid, this is about 7 centuries, I guess, after the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, and Virgil, as you write in your summary here, sadly wasn't able to finish the work. But there's a lot of good stuff within that work as it is. But it really owes everything to Homer and to the Iliad and the Odyssey. Anything else you want to share about the value of what Virgil gives us in the Aeneid?
Yeah, I think what it shows is that he and we are part of the great conversation. That if it hadn't been for Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, we could not have had the Aeneid. Virgil could not have written his epic because he peoples it with people that were first introduced to us in the Iliad, and he roots the story in the fall of Troy, which is the backdrop to the story of the Iliad. And then Dante, writing the greatest Christian poem, his guide through the Inferno, his guide through hell, is Virgil. Because Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, is Dante chooses as his, should we say, earthly mentor. So if it wasn't for Virgil, there might not be the Divine Comedy. And if it wasn't for the Iliad, the Odyssey, there might not have been the Aeneid. So in other words, each of these writers is part of a living tradition, conversation, where we build upon the foundations of previous generations to express ourselves in our own generation.
Yes, outstanding. Joseph Pearce is with us. Again, you can get the book at ignatius.com, Classic Literature Made Simple. What would you like to share with us about Hilaire Belloc? He's got a couple titles on the list. I've heard of him quite a bit. Haven't I know you've got some works on him that would be worth diving into. I know him as a great Catholic figure, but haven't, aside from coming across a few of his poems, haven't read either of the works we find here. Anything you can share with us?
Yeah, so first of all, Hilaire Belloc, I'm going to write something. I write a weekly essay for an online journal called The Imaginative Conservative, and this is a scoop for your show because no one knows this yet because I haven't written it, but I'm going to write a book called The Belloc Revival. So there's been a Chesterton revival in the last 20 or so years. Far more people will know G.K. Chesterton than was the case 20 years ago. Far more of Chesterton's books are back in print than was the case 20 years ago, because there's been this great Chesterton revival. When I begin to see signs of a Belloc revival, and this is much needed. Reason being that Belloc and Chesterton were great friends, and they were great allies and comrades in arms, and really the two most significant figures of the Catholic literary and cultural revival of the first third of the 20th century. So Belloc's a major historical figure, and he's a great literary figure. So he's one of the finest essayists in the English language who's ever lived. He's also one of the greatest poets who's ever lived, in my judgment. And he's also written great works of literature, of history. And it's particularly exposing the lies that was told about the Reformation in England. He's written wonderful works of history on that. But he wrote these two books I mentioned here, which are more literary, The Path to Rome and The Four Men, which are both real walks that he did, real hikes that he did, one to Rome and the other across Sussex in England, but with a mystical, metaphorical dimension. So The Path to Rome is not merely his particular pilgrimage to Rome on a particular period in 1900 at the turn of the 20th century. It's in some ways reflects our own pilgrimages to heaven, that Rome in this is home, and home not just with a lowercase h but an uppercase h, as in heaven. So the journey that he takes is a bit like the journey of life that all of us take. We make rash vows, we make mistakes, we fall, we get up again by the grace of God. We don't do what we should, but eventually, by the grace of God and with determination, we can actually get to the goal. And the goal, of course, in the story is Rome, but in the glory, if you like, is heaven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and where can we can keep up with you by going to your website, jpearce.co. So we'll be able to see any of your future writings if we're keeping track of you there, correct?
Yeah, that's definitely the best one-stop place for me. So everything I write online, I do actually post the links and also interviews such as this one. You know, when they go live, I post those on my site. So it's the best one-stop place to find out what I'm writing, what podcasts I'm doing, etc. There's lots of exclusive content for those that want to go deeper as well.
Terrific. Yeah, that's definitely worth doing. We want to stay tuned into what Joseph Pearce is up to. Again, his website, jpearce.co. Here's a title that, one of the few on the list that I had not heard of at all, and that is By What Authority? What can you share with us about this title and the importance of it?
So basically, again, this is a writer, R.H. Benson, Robert Hugh Benson, that has had something of a revival. So more people, his books, his novels coming back into print. That one, for instance, has been brought back into print again fairly recently. So Robert Hugh Benson, I should say Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson, he was a priest, was a convert to the Catholic faith. He was an Anglican priest who was a convert to the Catholic faith. A very controversial conversion because his father was the Archbishop of Canterbury, so if you like, the Anglican Pope, so to speak. So when the Archbishop of Canterbury's son becomes a Catholic and then a Catholic priest, it would certainly cause a great deal of controversy, probably the most controversial conversion in English history, apart from the conversion of John Henry Newman. But in his relatively short life, he died young in 1914, tragically. But in the 10 years that he was a Catholic, he wrote about a dozen or so novels, as well as poetry and other works. But his novels are wonderful in various genres, but the By What Authority, the one you mentioned, is an historical novel. He wrote several novels set during the time of the English Reformation, where he looks at the plight of English Catholics during times of great persecution and their courage in the face of such persecution to stay true to the church and to Christ in very anti-Catholic times and very anti-Catholic culture. So not only does it teach us about history, of course, there's something about this which is also perennial, that Caesar and Judas are always with us. So, those who want to be faithful followers of Christ are always having to deal with the persecution of Caesar and the treachery of Judas. So we see in that particular historical context during the time of the English Reformation, but it's applicable to our own times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, R.H. Benson, and he's one that also has two works on the list. I neglected to mention him in the beginning when we were talking about authors who have multiple works on the list. What can you share with us about his other title, Lord of the World?
Yes, so as I said, he probably excelled mostly and mainly, and is perhaps best known as a writer of historical fiction. But Lord of the World actually is a futuristic novel. It's what we might call a dystopian novel. So it's very similar, for instance, and should be seen, if you like, side by side with books such as Aldous Huxley's Brave New World or George Orwell's 1984. The difference is, however, that Benson is a profoundly Catholic author. So this understanding of the future is seen through Catholic eyes and not the sort of somewhat jaded eyes of Orwell and Huxley. But nonetheless, it's a dystopian future where we have an antichrist, a secular, global, what we would now call globalism, that this new globalist figure comes along, who basically tries to set up a globalized, globalist, secular world where ultimately Christianity is banned, and that person declares war on the church. And again, we see the Judas, we see Catholic priests becoming followers of this new religion. But we also see the courageous Catholic priests that stay true to the faith in spite of the persecution. So again, a very, very good futuristic novel about the dangers of secularism and the necessity for sanctity in the face of such secularism.
Incredible. Again, you can learn about this and all the titles we're discussing today in Joseph Pearce's new book, Classic Literature Made Simple. You can go to the publisher's website, Ignatius.com. You can go to Joseph's website, jpearce.co. And there's many other titles here. One, I guess, that jumps out to me is, many people know C.S. Lewis from the Chronicles of Narnia. Those aren't on the list, but we do have Till We Have Faces from C.S. Lewis. What can you share with us about this work?
Yeah, well, first of all, I love C.S. Lewis, and especially his literary works. I mean, his non-fictional works, such as Mere Christianity and Miracles, etc., are also wonderful. But I love his literary works. The reason the Chronicles of Narnia aren't in there, apart from the fact that you can only put 50 in, so you have to be selective, is that I would feel odd about writing about 7 books in one essay, and I certainly could not give all 7 works of the Chronicles of Narnia their own essay, and I wouldn't want to leave any of them out because they're all so good. So there's an omission there. Whether or not it's a sin of omission is for others to judge. But Till We Have Faces was his last great work of literature, and Lewis himself thought it was his best. So certainly it deserves to be taken very seriously. But Till We Have Faces basically is a myth retold. It's retelling a classic Greek myth, but from a Christian perspective. And what it's really about is how those who love someone in a selfish way, perhaps, in a needful way, respond when that person they love becomes a convert to faith and starts believing in God.
Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Joseph Pearce, talking about classic literature made simple. It's a new book from Joseph Pearce. It's going through with a great summary of 50 great books, classic works, good books. Highly recommend this. Ignatius.com. If you want to go to the publisher's website, get it there, Ignatius.com. You can also learn more about Joseph and all his good work over at jpearce.co. Joseph, I want to get to the final 2 works on the list, if we can. But before we do get to those 2 most recent books, anything further, any other titles that jump out to you leading up to those last 2 that you want to say a word on?
Well, I mean, obviously, all 50, I think, are very important books. That's why they're in there. There are many others that aren't in there that arguably should be, as we've already discussed. Now, I think the reason I wanted to have 2 living authors, 2 contemporary authors in there, is to show that this is a living conversation, the great conversation, as in tradition. Tradition is something that's alive because it lives in the past, but it also lives in the present and points and enfranchises the future. So that's why I wanted to have these 2 writers. I would say one thing, however, that I sort of break my own rules up to a point in doing so, because I say that great books are like great wine, that they improve with age. And whereas you don't canonize a saint until after he's died, you really shouldn't canonize a book until after the author has died, and probably until maybe 50 years or so after a book is published. So that's my general rule of thumb. But, for the reason I just said, just to show that this conversation is continuing, I thought I would put 2 of my favorite living authors in to conclude the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, it's the first that I've heard of, sadly, my own neglect here. The first I've heard of Declare by Tim Powers. But Father Elijah, I am familiar with. I did read that from Michael O'Brien several years back, and it was a striking experience that I don't forget. Found it very interesting and very edifying. So that's a good one. Anything? What would you like to share about these 2 titles with us?
Well, yeah. So first of all, it's Tim Powers, like Michael O'Brien, is a very devout, solid Catholic. The difference is that Tim Powers' works are sort of New York Times bestsellers, or they have been. He might be best known to the popular culture as his books, particularly a book called On Stranger Tides, was the inspiration for the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. So, he has this crossover into popular culture, but he's a solid Catholic. And I asked him, I know him, what did he consider to be his greatest book? Because I hadn't read him either. And what should I read first? And he said, well, I should read Declare. And I've read it. I've now read several of his other books. And so far, I agree with him that it's the best. So it's like a spy thriller set in the Cold War, begins in the Spanish Civil War, and ends in the 1960s. But there's a supernatural element. In all of Tim Powers' work, there's a supernatural element, often a demonic one. And that's because, of course, as a Catholic, he understands that the reality is not merely physical, but it's metaphysical. It's not merely, should we say, material but spiritual. So we are fighting against denominations and powers, and so that's that. And of course, Michael D. O'Brien. What can one say? I mean, he's a phenomenal storyteller. Has written many books. Father Elijah is probably the best known, arguably the best. Again, it's a bit similar to Lord of the World, which you spoke about earlier. It's this sort of dystopian. It's not set in the future, set in the near future. But it's apocalyptic. It shows again the rise of secularism, secular fundamentalism, anti-Christianity, globalism. So this backdrop, and then we have the faithful, holy, saintly Father Elijah, and how he contends with this legion, if you like, demonic legion that he faces in that novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's terrific. Yeah, Joseph Pearce is with us again. The book, Classic Literature Made Simple, Ignatius.com. Also, Joseph's website, jpearce.co. So down to our final minutes here. Joseph, just want to give you the floor. Anything else you want to share with us today?
Well, I think I just want to try to encourage people that, that the ways that we approach truth, we can approach it in the abstract way, as philosophers or mathematicians do, or we can approach it through the telling of story, looking up in wonder, and lyric poetry looks up in wonder, narrative storytelling tells stories through the gift of narrative. How does God himself revealed himself to us in the deepest way? Through entering the story. The greatest story ever told is Christ becoming part of history. History is his story. And within that story, Christ himself tells us stories, his parables, as means by which we can get deeper into the truth of the reality in which we find ourselves. And so literature is a means by which we can do that. And I think we shouldn't allow ourselves to think that fiction is not true. The fiction can convey some of the greatest truths in some of the deepest ways, and that's what I hope people might get from this book, and that's what I want to encourage people to get to know literature better, perhaps initially by buying this book and checking that out, and then going deeper from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's one question that kind of comes to mind. This might be a difficult one to answer on the spot, but out of all these titles, these 50 titles, some of them have been adapted onto the screen, movies or miniseries. Certainly, Shakespeare's works have been very, very much adapted, as well as many others. Is there any one adaptation of any of these into a movie or miniseries that jumps out to you that you would say really rises to the top of what you can recall is really most well done?
Yeah, the most faithful adaptation into the film medium of a great work of literature that's actually mentioned in that book is Brideshead Revisited. There's a British TV adaptation of Brideshead Revisited in the early 1980s, which I thoroughly recommend. I am actually quite fond of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies, even though there are things about them which I disagree. Adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. Who are the actors in it? And one of those. Some of them are not very good. So now I wish I remember the name of the actor who played Darcy in it. Anyway, people that know Jane Austen will know what I'm talking about. So generally speaking, I advise that you don't watch an adaptation of work of literature until you watch the work of literature first. And the reason is simple, that basically your imagination is gate crashed once you see a visual image. Where if you read the book first, you have your own images, and then you can test the adaptation from your own imagination. If you watch the film first, that's gate crashing you when you read the book. So try to read the book first before watching the adaptation.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, maybe what you're thinking of is the BBC miniseries Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth, maybe as Mr. Darcy. But yeah, there are others. Colin Firth
was the name on the tip of my tongue. Thank you so much, Jim, for saving me there.
Absolutely. Anything else you want to share about your good work? Anything else you're up to?
Well, I mean, again, I would encourage people to check out my website, jpearce.co, because there, everything that I'm doing basically can be seen in a one-stop place. You don't have to go over the place for me. So if you just get in the habit of going there, jpearce.co once a week, you won't miss anything, basically. So that would be the one recommendation I would make.
Excellent. Very good. All right. Well, it's been a great blessing. Again, thank you for taking the time and putting this book together, Classic Literature Made Simple. Certainly very, very helpful for me. I'm sure it's going to be very helpful for many others. Again, the publisher's website, Ignatius.com, Joseph's website, jpierce.co. Any final words of encouragement today, just in the final minute here?
Well, only one thing I always say is that we have to see reality in the light of super reality. Super reality is heaven. Basically, the triumph has already been won. If we see time from the perspective of eternity, we're never going to get too dismayed by how bad things are out there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Well, wish you a blessed Advent and Christmas season. And yeah, again, this fits right into it. A great opportunity to get a very wonderful gift for somebody that enjoys reading, or somebody that wants to enjoy reading, wants to get into it, not sure maybe where to begin. This is a wonderful book for so many. Again, want to also recommend it for those young people in your midst, a way to make reading interesting, right? Again, they can read through the summaries of these 50 titles and find out what's most interesting to them before diving in. Again, Joseph Pearce, jpierce.co. God bless you all.